Hey, and welcome back to today's episode of Separate Phallus, where we talk about how we, the people, are always dicked. And we're going to go ahead and break right into some more information on Ukraine. And as you can see on the screen right here, I have an article by the BBC that says, quote, "Telling my children my dad joined the war," which is just a little puff piece of propaganda that's pulling on the heartstrings, hoping to get you in favor of supporting the war, getting you in favor of attacking Russia, or potentially even joining the conflict yourself in Ukraine, where they're begging people to join them. And I want people to remember and understand that pulling on the heartstrings is one thing, but war is nothing but death and destruction. And so it's important, before you jump in, before anybody jumps in, that you know what this conflict is, what caused it, and why we're here. So before I go further, let's pull up a little image here of what war looks like. And this is, without dead bodies and blood and loved ones crying next to them. This is essentially what you turn the landscape into: an arid wasteland of fire and death and mangled steel and split and burnt trees and smoke and fire. And that's war. That's war every time. It's not unique to Ukraine. So before you jump head first, take a second, scan the horizon, and make sure that you're not going into this blind. So to make sure you're not going into this blind, it's important to know why we're here. What caused this, right? So a big part of what caused this is NATO and the United States versus Russia, right? But it's not really United States versus Russia. It's NATO and NATO's ongoing expansion to the east, and Russia and their version of NATO, the CSTO, which is not really expanding, but just kind of maintaining, and for the most part, I would say maintaining and establishing a buffer that gives them some distance between themselves and NATO allies. So let's go right here. So we've got a picture of CSTO versus NATO. And you can see in this, you've got NATO countries, which obviously includes the United States and Canada. You've got Iceland, Norway, United Kingdom, Denmark, Netherlands, Germany, Belgium, France, Slovenia, Croatia, Romania, you name it, Turkey. I mean, it's almost everyone in Europe, right? And then you see under the CSTO, which are friendly with Russia. You have Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Armenia, and then that little one that you see right underneath Lithuania, that little red dot, is part of Russia. That's Kaliningrad. And that also, so that is the CSTO, which is the Collective Security Treaty Organization. As NATO, in the green, has been pushing eastward towards Russia, obviously this is putting pressure on Russia. Now, NATO's been lining these border countries on the border of Russia with NATO equipment, anti-air equipment, personnel, and gaining more and more influence in those areas. Obviously, that's not a good sign if you're Russia or the CSTO, but we've all enjoyed this long-standing almost peace, although there's a lot of things that have happened that just don't seem to get into the news. But there's been this ongoing level of peace and tranquility between all of us. It's just been it's been a media war. It's been a lot of slander, a lot of propaganda, but nothing too physical. Just smaller conflicts. But now this little gray country, this region you see beneath Belarus, that is Ukraine. So you can see, if you were Russia, that you would not like having Ukraine turn green, joining NATO, and now you have a large country that is part of NATO jutting into what Russia believes is Russian territory. I mean, they believe that the eastern region of Ukraine, the Donbass region, they believe that that's Russian territory. That's a big problem for Russia, but it's not just that they're putting military pressure and creating this fear of aggression that is the problem. The other aspect of this is resources. So Russia's economy is almost exclusively propped up by oil and gas, and they have pipelines running from Russia throughout Europe, and they have several that go through Ukraine. And their concern, if you're Russia, is if NATO gains influence over Ukraine, then that could compromise those pipelines, whether it be destroying them or increasing the tariffs, and they're already paying billions and billions of dollars in tariffs just to Ukraine. But if they lose the pipelines because of NATO aggression or even Ukrainian aggression, then that's even worse. So that's a big part of it. Let's see here. And you can see right here on this one, let me make this one big for you. All right. You can ignore the title unless you really want to read it. It says Ukraine Civil War, pre-conflict oil and gas situation. And on this map, you are looking at gas fields, oil fields, gas basins, oil basins, shale gas blocks, and deep water drilling licenses where they found pockets that seem to be rich with oil. If you look in the eastern region of Ukraine, it is littered with gas fields, and then that orange blob that you see there is a shale gas block that is likely going to yield a lot of natural gas. I believe it's natural gas that comes from shale. Don't quote me on that. But Russia wants these. Russia wants to protect these. Russia has the capability of developing these fields and adding this to their economy and their outgoing or exports, if you will, whereas Ukraine right now doesn't really have that ability. Ukraine is kind of faltering. They've made some attempts. They've had companies like Shell and Chevron try to join the fold and try to develop these areas, but then they eventually pulled out because of fear of Russian aggression. So yeah, Russia has had an influence on why Ukraine hasn't developed these fields, but at the same time, Russia already has these pipelines going through. They already have a lot of influence on this industry in this region. So if you're Russia and you're looking at this and you know that you have NATO pouring in, gaining influence in a government that was already overthrown, essentially the color wars, regime change, the stuff that all these big players always do, Russia is saying that was done to Ukraine. They essentially accuse President or Prime Minister Zelensky of being a puppet of the West, which he might be. There's no way to know. But the threat against their resources is a big part of this. But it's not just oil. It's also water. So, since Crimea was annexed in 2014, Ukraine decided not to take it lying down, and they shut down the Dnieper River, preventing water flow into Crimea, which has dried up the farmland, condensed the villages, essentially starved off villages. I'm sure many people have died. I don't have data on it, but the water is essentially gone. Russia has made every effort. They've connected the land bridge that you see in the eastern area of Crimea to try to truck in water. They've spent they've spent several billions of rubles to try to develop this land to something that they can use for irrigation and farmland with no luck. So they've made their attempts. They have also attempted to file human rights lawsuits in international courts to try to get the global leaders to side with Russia in this regard, to open up the dam and allow water flow back into Crimea, because it's not just about Russian government. They're killing people, they're starving people, which you could argue, if you're watching this, you could argue, well, Russia's killing people and starving people in Ukraine right now. And I guess it's a tit for tat kind of thing. So I don't know if there's a way that this could have been directly prevented, but it seems like you have NATO pushing in on one side, you have the CSTO trying to maintain on another side, and more than likely trying to gain influence where they can. There was this ongoing influence war in Ukraine, and eventually it seems that Ukraine has started to kind of drift to the west, drift towards NATO, and that's putting pressure on Russia because they're worried about their oil and gas, and they're worried about their water that they're already struggling with in Crimea. And so they had to act. And they had to act before NATO positioned more and more troops and equipment and anti-air systems and everything else within Ukraine to make that attack even more impossible. Because let's be honest, NATO and the Western allies that make up NATO have very formidable militaries and the equipment and state-of-the-art equipment. at the very least. So, by blocking the dam, this is what Crimea is currently facing. You're looking at dry, desolate areas of land where there used to be large bodies of water that they could use for irrigation so that they could grow their crops, so that they could feed their families, so that they could have, their own little economy operating within Crimea, keeping to themselves. So now they don't. This is one of the elements that has caused Russia to act, whether it's this, or oil, or NATO pressure. So now you know. Now, obviously, you could look at it from Ukraine's point of view, and they're a sovereign nation, and they deserve every right to develop their own land without fear of aggression from Russia. And I get it, and you can be mad that Russia is invading, but you have to be objective and look at how things go around the world. The United States is no stranger to invading foreign lands to steal resources under the guise of ending terrorism, or really it's always under the guise of ending terrorism, but it's almost consistently circling the center of that is almost always protecting the petrodollar. So whether it's overthrowing and killing Saddam Hussein, whether it's overthrowing and killing Gaddafi, whether it's attempting to overthrow and attempting to kill Assad, those are just three that are relatively recent in my memory that I can call up, where those leaders were trying to get away from the petrodollar, right? Which, if the petrodollar falls apart, the United States dollar falls apart, and the way of life in the United States falls apart. So we have, in Russian times, not that long ago, you have an article in September of last year. Russia and China continued ditching the US dollar in settlements in favor of national currency. We are starting in September, and by the end of the year we can transfer virtually all payments for aviation fuel in China to yuan. That's what they said here. So they're already moving, and refueling Chinese airliners at Russian airports will be converted into rubles. So they're moving away from the petrodollar, which means the dollar is losing ground as the global reserve currency. Without that, if you think inflation is bad now, you haven't seen anything. When the dollar falls, and it will, especially if it loses status as the reserve currency, and as more countries potentially move away from the petrodollar, we will suffer. So, like I said in the podcast, the long form one we did the other night, you have to ask yourself, are you okay with some blood on your hands to live the comfortable and convenient life that you have? Because that's what it takes. And Russia doesn't seem to have any issue with it. I know that there's protests in Moscow, and there's protests in Russia. I'm sure there's ongoing protests all over the world where people are standing with Ukraine. But Russia's doing what the United States does. Russia's doing what all large, powerful countries do. And as much as I'm not in favor of it, I understand the way the game is played. You need to understand that too. You need to know the big picture, or you're always going to get digged. So I'm going to leave it right here. I hope that gave you enough information to, reason with yourself a little bit and understand that the media is not telling you the whole story. So if you want to, I would say go back a couple of years on your Google search or your DuckDuckGo search and look at older articles about Russia, about Ukraine, and about the petrodollar, and about the pipelines, whether it's Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2, or the many, many others in the web of pipelines that Russia has running through Europe. So with that said, please like, subscribe, hit the notification bell. I'd love to have you join us when we do our long-form podcasts. I think you'll enjoy them. We sit here to me and Doc, and we have a drink, and we talk about what's going on in the world, and we try to have a good time with it. So with that, I'm going to let it go here. So thanks for watching Semper Fallis, where we the people are always dicked.